everyone, and welcome to episode 71 of the Solosaurus podcast. I'm Michael Eckenfels.
I'm Martin Gonzalez.
And I'm Drake Villareal.
And today, as you can tell, we have a guest on the show, Drake Villareal, game designer and head of internal development for Final Frontier Games. Drake, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, great to be here. As you mentioned, I'm the head of internal development for Final Frontier Games. In addition to working with them, I also freelance. I'm a designer, developer, and more recently, I've gotten into doing solo designs for both Final Frontier and for other companies.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I'm excited.
We're happy to have you here, Drake.
Very happy.
Usually it's just me and Michael, so it gets kind of lonely.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate that.
Well, I was kind of surprised when I learned that the solo podcast wasn't just one guy talking to an AI opponent.
That's what I'm saying.
Well,
you know what? I'm gonna put the blame for that squarely on Brandon and Carter, who started this show over 2 years ago. They were the ones who started the trend of two people in a solo podcast. So we're just following in their footsteps.
Yes.
Maybe I'll design you an AI guest host that you can flip a card out every now and then.
Oh, that's perfect.
That would be amazing. Oh my gosh.
Awesome. Then roll on a chart to see. Yeah, that'd be great.
Roll a d6. Does your host actually get your joke? No.
Does the audience get the joke? Does Michael say wargame or say a funny voice? Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, this podcast is brought to you by Stone Valley Games, your friendly, distant game store. Check them out at stonevalleygames.com. It's a great shop because most of the games over there are great for solo players. So we invite you over there, check out the site, see what's there, especially because he's always adding new content to the storefront. It's also very important to support a small family-run solo-friendly game store.
Yeah, that's our friend Eric, right, over at Stone Valley Games.
That is Eric.
Tell you what, I'm very excited because Eric's sending over a copy of Warp's Edge, which I can't wait to get into my greedy little hands.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that too. He's also sending me a copy of Australia. And it's funny because the first time you talked about that game, I thought it was some kind of zombie thing because Z was pronounced in the title. And I thought, oh boy, okay, it's another freaking zombie
It's not a zombie game, Michael. Gosh,
I know, Martin.
Get it right.
I saw that and then I looked it up and I'm like, hey, that's kind of cool. I'm not normally into Cthulhu kind of mythos stuff, but I do have several Cthulhu themed games.
It's a Cthulhu game set in the Australian outback. It's the most normal thing ever.
It's cool. It's got strategic aspects to it. And without going into great detail here, and another tangent, go figure, I think I'm really looking forward to that. So I'm very thankful to Eric over at Stone Valley Games for sending that to us for review. That will be coming up in the future.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much. Today's solo news is brought to you by TableFor1.me, where we here at the Solosaurus podcast exclusively get our one-player game news. So thanks always to Frederick Schultz of TableFor1.me for his continuing efforts to bring us solo gaming news. And by the way, you can also read his solo gaming news blog over on Board Game Geek. Hopefully I will remember to add that link to the show notes after the show. I've been notorious for forgetting things like that. So I apologize. I don't mean to be inconvenient there, but you can easily find Frederick's blog page over on Board Game Geek, I believe. So we found 3 games that we thought we could talk about here. And the first one is Shadow Network. So this is where the title says Becoming a Broker of Secrets and Espionage from publisher Talon Strikes Studios. And it's really interesting artwork. It looks like something out of the 40s, like spies on the radio and, meeting in deserted street corners to make exchanges and drops and things like that. And that's really kind of what the game looks like. It's a worker placement style game. Players are deploying agents to gather intel, fragments of intel, and they piece them together to use. And apparently you can also leak that intel out. The map looks really freaking cool, actually. You got anything on this one, Martin, by chance? Because I'm really intrigued by this.
Yeah, no. So when I saw the game, I saw the news article, and I realized it was a 1960s Cold War themed worker placement game. I got very very excited because I am a complete sucker for that theme. Related to that, I'm also excited about Pandemic Legacy Zero, which is also in a similar theme. The art looks freaking gorgeous. And those are the big draws for that game for me. Drake, do you know anything about Shadow Network?
I don't, but I do think that the Cold War as a theme is pretty compelling, because it leads to a lot of mechanics like brinksmanship, which I find fascinating but sort of underused. I'm not sure if this uses that, but yeah, I'd be interested to check that out.
Yeah, I'm definitely pretty excited about it.
It's interesting to note that there's a lot of, well, there's not a lot of games in this era, but one of the most popular games ever, Twilight Struggle, is set within that range. And one of my own personal favorites, 1960, The Making of a President, which is the election campaign between Kennedy and Nixon. That's a lot of fun too. But when I first looked at this, I thought it looks like a World War II thing, and I thought, okay, would be. But then I saw Cold War era. That's cool. So that looks neat. Next one, Tinner's Trail. Publisher Alley Cat Games announces remastered edition of Tinner's Trail from designer Martin Wallace. This is, let's see, originally published in 2008 by Tree Frog Games. So this is what used to be a 3-player game or more. It's now been stretched to include an official solo mode. So that's why it's hit our radar here. Martin, do you know anything about Tinner's Trail by chance? It looks like a remake here.
I do not know anything about Tinner's Trail, but I do have a lot to say about Martin Wallace, starting with the fact that he is the best first name ever in gaming.
Yes.
And also, he is one of my favorite designers, completely on the strength of a game that you mentioned earlier, Australia. That was the first time that I'd ever experienced a Martin Wallace game. I was blown away. And so now I am instantly extremely interested in anything that the gentleman does. So that's why I'm looking forward to that.
I like checking out Martin Wallace's games. I'm not sure that I love all of them, but I think he does a lot of interesting things as far as using mechanics. Typically, when a game comes out like this that I'm not sure that I'll get a chance to play or the people around me will play, I stay pretty up to date watching lots of like how to play videos and stuff. So I think this one will probably fall into that. See if I've got any interest in it, and then go from there.
Yeah, it looks kind of. I mean, I recognize the name, of course, but I'm afraid I couldn't name anything other than Australia just because it's on my mind currently on that. And I know that's
I can
probably
name
heresy.
Hit Z Road is another Martin Wallace game. Very light, kind of a zombie apocalypse survival game. But it's also one of my go-tos. Like if I don't feel like playing anything at all, but I feel like playing something. I don't know if you ever get into that state as a solo gamer where it's like, yeah, I want to play something, but no, I don't want to play anything too heavy. Hit Z Road is basically my go-to, and you can knock out a game of that in about 20 minutes. It's a lot of fun.
Every time you mention that, it makes its way into my cart for a little while. So we'll see how it goes this time. So that is going to hit Kickstarter in January of 2021. Our final bit of news is on a game called Yiddle. Is it Yiddle or Yeddo? Anybody?
That's a good question.
I would say Yiddle.
Yeddo. Okay. Drake, would you
That's
say
my
Yeddo?
story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, probably. Yeto.
Okay.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Okay. Publisher Board and Dice is bringing our third news item to you, Yiddle Deluxe Master Set to Kickstarter for a second print run. It's going to feature some art overhauls, graphic design, new modules, such as something called Specialists, which grant disciples unique character abilities, as well as a solo mode created by David Turchi. So, Drake, you know something about Yiddle, I believe.
Just a little bit. Yeah, I remember that it was on Kickstarter last year, the Deluxe Master Set. So I'm guessing that it did well enough with its critical reception and potentially at retail that it warranted this second printing. I did find it interesting though that they're launching on a Monday. But as far as stuff about the game, I don't really know much beyond the vaguely what the theme is and the fact that it is a worker placement game.
Sounds good. It's got a Japanese, it looks like an ancient Japanese feel to it. I see samurai on the cover. That's kind of a cool thing for me. So I'm probably going to check that one out just for the principle of it. So that one will kickstart on October 26th. As Drake said, it's going to be actually tomorrow, as far as this recording is concerned. But when you're listening to this, it'll be a few weekends or weeks in the past. So go ahead and check that out if you are interested. All right, so we have Drake Villareal on our show as a interview guest. We want to get into your mindset on how your design experience has been and what you do, what drives you, things you're interested in, things like that. So first, I think foremost, the big question: how did you first get involved in game design?
Oh boy. So there's it's kind of two parts to this. One is modern game design, like the last 8 years, and then especially the last 3 years or so. But game design in general, um, I want to say about the year 2000. I was on the internet, as a 9, 10-year-old kid, um, and I was really into playing Yu-Gi-Oh at the time. Like I'd go play it like a weekly tournament. I'd be competitive with the older kids, that kind of stuff. But my real passion was in making my own custom cards. So there was websites where you could find a cool image, and then it would like set in all the text for you and all the different like criteria. And I mean, I remember making the full sets, like 100 cards, and thinking about like, ooh, what's the cool new mechanic in this set, and entering contests and all that stuff. So kind of as long as I could remember, I've had a creative streak for tabletop games. And then of course, at some point I fell into the whole, I want to be a video game designer, which what kid doesn't? But then you ask them what they actually want to do, and it's like, I just want to have cool ideas, and they don't want to learn to like program or model or do those kinds of things. And that's how it kind of felt for me. Is like,
Right.
that's a lot of technical knowledge for something that it was, I guess, kind of more of a hobby. But I kind of drifted away from these kind of things. Played a little bit of Yu-Gi-Oh throughout the early 2000s. But it was really in college. I went to go play D&D with a friend, and 2 people didn't show. So instead he's like, hey, let's play a board game. I was like, sure. And he pulled Pandemic off the shelf, and it was just over at that point. I,
You're like, never mind this D&D stuff.
yeah, I mean, it was just fascinating. Like the game itself is fine, but whenever I think about Pandemic, I think about how much I just am in love with the mechanical brilliance of the epidemic mechanic, where it
Yeah.
intensifies and then refreshes and doubles down on the areas that it's already been to. And that
yeah.
really showed me that you can extrapolate you can abstract out these concepts into something that's really compelling to play with and makes a lot of sense on a systems level, but is also heavily based on a theme. So it's this weird interplay of like logic and art, and it was just amazing. So right after I went home from that, I started designing.
Can I just say, Drake, that you're speaking language to my heart right there, because there's very few things in gaming that annoy me more than a game mechanisms and theme that really just seems pasted on, and like I have curse that I can tell, and then I get turned off instantly. So I really just hunger for tight integration between theme and game mechanisms, and one should reinforce the other, and vice versa. So I'm curious, how do you feel about that? Because anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So there's a big thing about one of the most common questions that you get asked as a designer, or you see other designers get asked, is which comes first for you, theme or mechanics? And I've sort of been getting some resentment for that question, because I feel like it sort of gives the wrong idea to new designers and to people who don't design, that somehow it's formulaic, or somehow it actually is like you have to pick one or the other, and then the other one will suffer. But in reality, I really think that games, they have to be integrated with the theme, or else there's no point. So for instance, if you really wanted to, you could go into Agricola and sort of reverse engineer it to the point where it is just a few different symbols and then a bunch of numbers, and then everything else about the game can be abstracted away. But at that point, I really think the game would be nearly impossible to play because you don't have any thematic anchors for the stuff that you're doing. Which is why when I teach games, it's always really important for me to have a strong thematic hook as far as, you start the game and you tell people like, hey, we are farmers in the 1600s. Without telling me anything else, I know that I need to probably grow stuff and manage animals. And based on the fact that it's the 1600s and we're peasants, I might also need to feed myself and take care of my family. So without telling me anything about how the game is played, you've already given me the thematic anchors to attach any number of mechanisms to. And I think people do have a really good sense, like you're saying, of things that are sort of pasted on, because there's a disconnect there. So one of the big things is in movies is a suspension of disbelief, right? Like you can get into Captain America, even though the super serum or whatever is kind of science fiction nonsense, because it's believable enough that you can sort of let it go. But when something isn't believable enough, like if there's just straight up bad science, or if somebody drops something in a movie and it goes up or something, that kind of stuff is just wrong.
So, Drake, you said that Pandemic was the first board game you ever played?
First
Right.
modern game, yeah.
What was your first modern purchase then? I'm curious. What so you finally did make the decision you're going to dive into board gaming, and you're going to the store and you're like, I have no idea where to start. Which one? What was your first one, or did you buy Pandemic first?
So my first purchase was a little bit weird. I got onto Cool Stuff Inc. and filled up $100 worth of stuff, and some of the games were all right. Some of the stuff was just like me learning to be an informed consumer. So, for instance, I got Defenders of the Realm because it was like, ooh, Pandemic, ooh, fantasy. I like fantasy a lot. And I got Defenders of the Realm, and it's fine. It's not a great game. I can't even remember the last time I played it. But I know that was one of the first games that I got. In that same group, I also got Through the Desert and Power Grid. So those are some of my first purchases. Just kind of an odd smattering of just stuff that happened to be popular and in stock at the time. Since then, I've grown a lot more discerning with the types of things that I'll purchase. So.
Makes sense. Yeah. Some of us, we just see pretty colors, purchase immediately. I do that anyway, more than I should.
Well,
I get a lot of review copies, but yeah.
I just want to give Drake kudos for starting off smart, right? Like, let's go to Cool Stuff Inc. and let's fill a cart with $100 so that we get that free shipping. I wasn't that smart until about 2 years in.
Hey, well, that's how they get you, right? You could order a $30
That's how they
game,
get you.
but for just $70 more, you don't have to pay shipping.
Yeah. That makes sense.
It's interesting. It's interesting to note too. Stone Valley Games does offer that $100 or more in free shipping, and also free shipping to military individuals and contractors serving overseas. So there you go. Yeah, it's always, it seems everybody kind of does that, and you have to do that to be a viable business.
Yeah, there's a weird value proposition thing there where it's like, would you rather pay $15 for something and $5 shipping, or $20 and get free shipping? And it's like, there's that idea that the thing that you bought is worth a certain amount and that you're getting a deal on it versus...
Right. Yeah, I see that all the time. I see the game for sale on a website and it's, say, $45. Oh, that sounds like, and with free shipping. Oh, that sounds like a good deal. Then I go look at it on the company site and it's $35 plus shipping. Okay. Where's the deal, right?
Drake, I'm curious, as someone who has, who aspires to be a budding game designer myself. I want to find out what would you say is your philosophy toward designing solo games and designing solo modes in particular, and where do you stand on the whole beat your high score versus no, I want a solo AI question?
So in regards to the question about solo AI versus beat your own score, and this sort of ties into my general philosophy of things. It's, if possible, make an AI opponent. If not possible, beat your own score is fine. Because typically the reasons that you can or can't make an AI opponent are exclusionary with the things that make a beat your own score game fine. Like, for instance, a puzzly game or a game with very low interaction does not need an AI opponent. Because at that point, you're just setting some sort of black box score for them. Like, every turn, roll a dice into a tray. And at the end of the game, reveal the tray and see, add up all the dice and see what they scored. It sort of feels like that. So if it's going to be that, then it might as well lean in all the way and get rid of all the minutia and all the unfun management and just let you play the game. However, if the game has any amount of critical interaction, I think an AI opponent needs to be considered first. So sort of my first step with approaching a solo game is to see if I even think it's possible and what kind of solo mode will work best for it. I think flowcharts can work for things, but I'm not particularly a fan of them. I just think they're just a little bit too rigid. So I prefer card-based systems of some kind. But yeah, the first thing to do is identify every single interaction point in the game. Whether it is a super critical action or interaction point, or whether it's something very passive, like the fact that you go second means that this thing isn't available because the first player tends to claim it. So there's a lot of like surface level interaction that's really easy to see, like, hey, there's a guy in that spot, I can't go there. But then there's very subtle other things where it's like, oh, every time you discard a card, it goes to this market. Well, if the AI is not discarding cards, then that system is getting starved. And I think that that's what a few solo modes fall into, is they forget some of those minor interactions. And what it leads to is the solo game playing fairly differently in terms of strategy from the core game experience.
Right. No, yeah, that's a really, really good point. A couple of things I want to just emphasize there is, personally, for me as a solo gamer, I love a solo AI deck. I mean, just straight up. It's also connected to the fact that I'm very, very bad at comprehending rules. And so a solo AI deck, it tells me what the next thing is to do. And so I don't have to refer to the rules. So that's great. Yeah. And so I forget the other thing I wanted to respond to that you said that was brilliant, but yeah, I appreciate that. Definitely. Thank you for sharing your philosophy. Michael, all over to you, sir.
I'd like to expand upon that a bit. So from my perspective, being a player, period, I do have to agree with Martin. I love the card draw aspect. That's actually something in a lot of games that involved warfare that I play. Interceptor Ace and Night Fighter Ace are two in particular that the AI, you don't want to call it AI so much, but it is in a way, because you're essentially drawing what happens, what other aircraft in the game are doing before you, and then you make your decisions based off of that. It seems to me mind-boggling difficult to come up with a system of AI where you're keeping all those things in mind, not just the major interactions, but the minor ones too. I think a lot of games also kind of heavy-handedly put the AI into competition with you, and Outer Rim comes to mind, as well as 51st State too, Martin. I mean, we've talked about this before, where it's just that the game is given this advantage where it just gets these rewards as it goes through the game, and you're busy trying to, first of all, catch up, build something efficient and quickly enough to catch up to it, and then surpass it, hopefully. Uh, I'm just mind boggled as to how you even begin to wrap your head around this. Is this something you create from scratch? Do you get your ideas from other game designs?
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't even know where.
So this is actually my favorite part of solo design is the challenge of it. So essentially, it's with the video game, you have all of the benefit of hiding things under the hood. So any amount of behaviors, any amount of scripting, it can all be hidden under the hood, and it'll ultimately boil down to the AI character doing something that seems reasonable. But even in video games, they've got pretty strict sets of rules how they operate, and it doesn't take players long to figure out how they operate and to abuse it. So you see, like, a lot of these games that come out, like the Elder Scrolls, and it's like this great fantasy adventure, and then you go and you watch somebody play, and they're standing on top of a rock shooting at somebody so that they can't be reached by the sword. You know what I mean? Like it gets into this almost an exploitation of the systems rather than an interacting with them. And with the board game, you just can't do that. It's almost kind of like there's nothing to hide behind, like everything's on display. And because the player has to physically manage all of this stuff, it really puts limits on the amount of things that you can actually have players manage. So one of the ways to get away from the management is, the sort of threshold that I look at for the games that I make is I don't want players to spend more than about 10 or 15% of their time managing the AI. And they should 100% never have to make a decision for the AI. It should kind of run through its thing, run through it quickly. But it also needs to leave some sort of trace on the game. And this is one of the most important things that I think is often forgotten, and why some people who aren't big into solo malign solo games, because they assume that solo games fall into this trap where they're trying to give the impression of a player, but only the back half of a player. So the back half of a player is like what the player actually does, but they never show intentionality. And that's like my big thing is the AI has to be semi-predictable. So you can look at them and you can say, I generally know what they might do, what their options are, what their preferences are, even based on the game state that's currently out, as opposed to like flip a card and something happens. And it's kind of the same reason that I think event decks get a bad rap, is because it feels like there's no signaling, there's no predictability. It's just something that happens. And if it's just something that happens, it feels as good as random, because by the time you've like learned all of the parts of the game and actually know how to incorporate this knowledge, it's, I don't know. I would hate for somebody to ever play one of my games, not enjoy it, and then have me or somebody else respond to them and say like, oh, you just need to play it a few times to understand how it works.
Yeah, no.
It's really, it's got to be clear the first time,
It's got to be intuitive.
Exactly. I got a big kick out of, I was at an event with Matt Leacock, and we were talking a little bit, and somebody was playtesting Era back when it was a roll and write, and essentially they had said that this game is really fun, but I think after maybe 10 or 12 plays, I'll have seen everything the game has to offer. Do you have any plans to address the variability or the replay value of the game? And Matt just kind of smiled and was like, I'd be happy if somebody played my game 10 times. So I think that's more of that feeling is, the game needs to stand on its own the first time that you play it. So it doesn't just feel like a bunch of random things are happening. So it has to be semi-predictable. It has to give you some indication of what the thing wants to do, because then you can play against it and not just near it.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to jump off of a point that you made earlier. You said something about never requiring the player to make choices on behalf of the AI, which I absolutely 100% agree with. So this, for me, calls to mind the kind of rules for Automa AI opponents. This is, of course, popularized by Morten Modrad Peterson of the Automa Factory. And I believe they started this trend with the solo mode for viticulture. So just super quick, I know everybody on this pod knows that, but for our listeners, kind of the rules that they codified are, an Automa should have 3 rules. It's kind of like Asimov's 3 rules of robotics, right? Number 1, they should represent an opponent who can win or lose, much as a human opponent would, and not rely on beat your previous high score unless beat your score is part of the core experience of the game. Number 2, should not be a full AI simulation, but instead should interact with the game and the player enough to feel like an opponent, but streamlining a lot of the details. And then number 3, and the point that you made earlier, Drake, was never require the human player to make choices on behalf of the Automa. I'm just curious, how do you feel about these rules? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Because when I read it, I'm like, wow, this really helped shape my own personal thinking about, what a good solo mode should be. And I wonder how you feel about it.
Yeah, I think they're right on the nose, and if anything, I think they're actually missing two more tenants, two more
Hmm.
steps, and so sort of my the heritage that I have of the solo design comes from, Atoma did viticulture, and then David Turchi played viticulture and loved that and used that as his basis for his modes, and then he worked with Johnny Pack on Sierra West and Coloma together, and through them working together, Johnny Pack sort of learned how he approaches it, so that when Johnny Pack, Carl Van Ostrand, and I did Merchant's Cove together, um, Johnny did the first iteration of the solo mode based on all of the tenets and design principles that David had developed from Automa Factory. And then I took those and just like, I don't know how else to put it. Like I went hard on it. I kind of like started thinking like, how can this thing be even smarter? How can this thing create an even better experience? But as far as the rules that you were saying, I would absolutely say that, those three are super important. But the two that I would add on to that is the first thing, and this sort of ties into the second one, but the first thing is that it has to be lightweight. Because really with enough complexity and components and all these other things, you could probably make a reasonable functioning AI for anything. It would just be a nightmare to play. So making sure that it's like quick, streamlined, easy to understand, that sort of 10-15% rule that I try to use as far as the amount of time spent managing them. I would definitely add that as another one. But the most important thing to me is the semi-predictable. So, when you play with another player, they're not just doing random things unless they're weird. Like they're going to be having intentionality. They're going to want certain things. They're going to ignore certain things, but there's a path dependency to it. So it's like, if such and such thing has happened at some point, such and such thing becomes more likely or less likely in the future. And what it all kind of boils down to is that solo game design forces you to kind of confront the core game itself and to really understand the heuristics of all the decision making. Because solo game design is literally just extrapolating the heuristics into a like semi-randomized opponent. So it's got to have, a lot of the solo design that I actually end up doing these days. It comes down to a lot of like, what is the AI's preference and how do they break ties when they prefer multiple things? And then to do that, you just think, well, how does a player break ties when they mentally see two things they want? So it's those kinds of things, is understanding why people make decisions in the game and then trying to mirror that.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And I've now added two more things to those three laws of robotics for myself. So,
hey, yeah, I mean, if you make a solo design and it passes those 5 things, I mean, I feel like you got to be at least halfway there,
Awesome.
Drake, what would you say is your favorite design? All the solo modes you've made, co-design games, whatever. What's your favorite and why?
I mean, I always got to go back to Merchant's Cove. I think, for one thing, it'll be the first published game that I've got out there, and it's a co-design with 2 others. But just the sheer amount of stuff that I put into the solo, in addition to the core game, it's it's with 3 other people, but it still feels like my baby. Like every time I play it, I can point to all the different things, like, ooh, that was my idea, or that was my idea. But beyond that, I enjoy it because it's simply, it's just a game I enjoy playing. Like, I know that sounds like a weird bar to have, because obviously people enjoy playing the games that they enjoy playing. But I play games for more reasons than strictly enjoyment. I also do it for novelty and research purposes. So when I find a game that I really, really enjoy, that's always something special. And with Merchant's Cove, I just can't wait for it to be in people's hands, because it's so it's essentially this large asymmetric Euro game, where each player is a different fantasy merchant in a fantasy town. So like we have an alchemist and a blacksmith and a sea captain, and they're each running their own shop and playing their own game. However, they're all interacting with the core mechanism of the game, which is the market. So there's these meeples coming in on boats to create customers, and you're creating things to sell to them. And when we were designing this game, it was just a fascinating case study, both in game design and in asymmetry. And then once we got all of that locked in, it became fascinating for the solo design aspect of it, because there's a substantial amount of solo content in the game. So when you get the core game, there's the solo mode and a hard mode. And then everybody who backed during Kickstarter got a free expansion. And in that expansion, there is a challenge deck. So you can play the solo mode with the challenge deck. And then there's also a book of scenarios. So it's like 12 thematic rule bending ways to play the game that offers just like some new challenges and stuff. But yeah, as far as my favorite designs, not to talk it up too much, but I'm in love with Merchant's Cove. And that's not true of all my designs. I mean, there's dozens of things that I've shelved because wasn't entirely happy with it, but yeah, that's the one.
I got you. I've looked at excuse me. I've looked at that game, and I got to tell you, I'm really intrigued by it. I just watched Rado's playthrough video of it to kind of get a feel, and I'm really that's kind of cool the way that different characters do accomplish their goals in different ways. It's not the same across the board. Like one rolls dice, one's a rolling right. That's pretty fascinating. So when is that coming out? Just curious. When's that hitting the stores?
We kickstarted it last year, and it's going to be fulfilling at the beginning of next year. It's one of those things where between we hit Chinese New Year, then COVID, and then just all kinds of other, little tiny things like, the box insert needs to be ever so slightly adjusted. So those types of things. But yeah, it's looking like early next year. But yeah, one of the cool things about that game is it kind of represents how I approach a lot of my game designs, where the first step, it has to be research before you do anything else. So we sort of dug into like, what are the big asymmetric games? Why do people like them? But also, why do people not like them? So, Root right now is kind of the industry gold standard for heavily asymmetric games. But what we noticed is that Root takes a lot of design heritage from war games, whereas we hadn't really seen something that we considered an asymmetric Euro game. So we really started thinking about what's critical to Euro and what's critical to asymmetry. And what we came up with was essentially a system where you don't have to know how the other players play to be able to play the game with them. So like in Root, it matters, like you interact with this other person in a certain way. But in this game, all of the interaction is sort of standardized in that people spend time as their unifying resource, and everybody produces their own unique things. But generally they are a certain color and a certain size. So it creates these these points where all the different characters run together and are the same, which is where it matters as far as like the interaction and the signaling and the interplay with the other players. But when it comes to what you do by yourself and running your own little shop, it's completely asymmetric. Like you're rolling dice and one player is doing like a potion explosion marbles thing. So
Drake, I got one for you. This is a toughie. What are your top 3 favorite solo games or modes that you wish you had designed?
Oh man. Gosh, that's tough because I feel like solo design it's evolving so rapidly that a lot of the things that were good solo experiences a few years ago aren't holding up as well. I don't know about 3, but I think one that, this one might be obvious. Would have loved to have designed Mage Knight. The game itself and the solo mode.
Right.
Mage Knight's actually a game that I talk about quite a bit when I talk about theme and mechanics.
Right.
Because in addition to the epidemic mechanic from Pandemic that I really love for theme and mechanic reasons, this is like my second example, which is the wound system. And it's like, you get a blood drop into your hand and it doesn't do anything. And it's like there's like a negative space of game design there, where by something existing in a spot and by not doing something in a spot, it is thematically telling you that you were hurt and you are now suffering the ramifications of being hurt by having a reduced power. So it's just like the ultimate example of a really, really clean mechanical implementation of a really, really strong thematical idea. So yeah, but absolutely
Very
Mage
cool.
Knight.
I just find it funny because we had a conversation about Mage Knight a few episodes back. Mage Knight did not fare well. Took a lot of wounds in that conversation.
Well, I mean, a lot of people love that game, and there's no disparaging that, of course. I mean, if it's got a following, of course, it's made an impact, but we weren't terribly impressed with it. I played Star Trek Frontiers. I didn't play Mage Knight itself.
Yeah, and even that's one of the things that I think it speaks to how rapidly the art of solo design is evolving. But truth be told, I can't keep up with all the stuff that come out, so I actually rely on people who do solo playthrough videos a lot. And being in a lot of groups, reading what a lot of people are playing, kind of keeping my ear to the ground, seeing what the common complaints are, and like what, anytime somebody says like, ooh, this is great, I have to go watch a video and see what's going on there.
So for me, I want to jump off from something that you said earlier, that you felt that what constitutes a good solo mode is evolving very rapidly, and stuff that were good solo modes in the past, probably not, so much now. So would you say that the sophistication and tastes of the players are evolving, and how is that interplaying with solo game designers, and what's kind of driving, solo game design trends and philosophies?
So there's this thing where, or there's this idea that like a great scientist will advance the technology of humanity by decades in one fell swoop. And I kind of get that same idea that every now and then somebody comes along and introduces some new fundamental or has some new design that kind of becomes a gold standard. So I think really Automa Factory digging into it and sort of treating it with the proper respect was the first step. And then from there,
Right.
It's been the people like David Turchi to grab onto those things and to continue to try and like push them to see how they can go. But it's interesting because the trend hasn't been for more and more complicated and stuff like that in a way that board games kind of have gone. It's actually been for more elegant like solutions.
Right.
So that's another interesting thing about it, is that while the complexity of games relatively seems to be going up, the complexity of the solo modes that are attached to them, as far as AI components are concerned, seems to be going down, which is a good trend.
Great. I like that trend.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to just really understanding why people play games solo, and why some people don't play games solo. And I think a lot of the times, if you have people who don't know that or who don't bother to learn that, kind of the proof is in the pudding. Like you can see it, like, oh, this person doesn't care about things being semi-predictable, but everything else is right. It's, quote, by the books. So you flip a card, something happens. It's, like they're trying to do the right thing. They've seen the right thing done, but they haven't really done the homework and the research to know why those things are successful or why they succeed.
No, yeah, that's I really appreciate that. I just want to just tack on to this before I pass it off to Michael for I think the last question. But I think that I started out as a solo gamer not having a problem playing multi-handed just to be able to solo a game. But as time, for me personally, as time has gone on, and as the demands on my time have gotten greater, and especially in 2020, right, where
Right.
the cognitive load of just sitting and you know having to multi-hand, even like a medium weight, even just a medium weight solo game is sometimes it's too much. So I really appreciate the things that you're saying, that good solo modes in general are trending toward more streamlined, easier to operate, but still figuring out how to be crunchy and satisfying. And that really works for me. And I find myself no longer having the patience to multi-hand games that I used to be able to. And now I really look for, whereas I didn't before, I really look for just like true solo, single-handed play.
Right.
That's been my trend personally. So I'm very glad to hear that solo mode designers are also kind of going in directions that are aligned with where I'm headed, selfishly where I'm headed as a solo player.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the reason they're going that way is people are now realizing, like, before it was good enough to just let people play the game. You could technically play chess against yourself if you really wanted to. And for the people who really, really want to do it, they're going to do it and don't worry about it. But now people are realizing, like, hey, if there's somebody who loves games so much that they'll play chess against themselves, maybe they'll buy your game or be more likely to buy your game if you include an AI opponent for them. So, I think it just makes a lot of sense, like economics wise for the industry.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. Michael, over to you, buddy.
Drake, last question. And this might be kind of an odd one, but you've kind of alluded to this over the course of the interview. Do you think you design more for what you find is interesting for yourself, or more for the audience, what you think they find interesting?
So I design at all for myself because it's a challenge. I love it. It's artistry, all this other stuff. But when it comes to the actual design itself and the choices that are made, it's 100% for the people who are going to be playing the game. I want people to be able to play the real game, because a lot of people use solo just to teach themselves stuff, and that's something that I don't want to forget either. Is while there are people who play solo predominantly as their way of playing board games and they enjoy it and they buy games for solo, there are also people who just play solo to learn the rules so that when they go to game night they can teach other people. And if the game is drastically different, then I'm not hitting that goal, because then they're learning to play something that doesn't translate well. And to that end, which is one of the reasons, like when I start a solo design, I typically will give myself some very small allotment of components, like 20 cards or something, and maybe like one token, but as few as possible, and then even try to go down from there, because the feeling is that the less extra stuff that you have to put in the game, the closer it will be to the core experience of it. So if you've got to introduce all these extra tokens, all these extra rules and exceptions and other things for the AI, it just it complicates things, and it gets away from what I'm doing. But yeah, as far as designing for myself or the audience, it's 100% the audience. I'm always lurking around to the groups, seeing what people are playing, seeing what people like. And I'm especially interested when people actually talk about why they liked something or why they didn't like something.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, excuse me, it makes sense to design for your audience, because ultimately the board gaming business is a business, right? So you want to sell, you want to make money, you love doing it, and that's almost a universal thing across the board, I think, for every game designer. Even some make games without even wanting to get paid. Some make solo variants on BGG for free and just put them out there, that kind of a thing. But you always want to think of your audience, of course. But I was thinking more along the lines of, is if you think something's cool, do you design in that direction? What works for you. You know what you find fun.
So
Do you think your audience always finds that same thing?
yeah, I guess my answer to that, I don't want to sound conceited, but in a way I feel like the sensibilities that I have for making this thing and what I think is fun has been crafted based on what I think people like and what I like. So it's
Right.
it's a bit of a hybridization, but the hope is that there's never a conflict of interest. I've never had to make a sacrifice where, like, oh, this isn't cool, but it's got to be in there for the players, or ooh, this is really cool, but the players don't get to have this
Right,
because
okay.
it's too complicated, it's whatever. Because generally
Exactly.
when I'm doing the designs, I don't actually get the choice to add things or to make quite those kinds of decisions. It's more about being clever, like how I talked about Mage Knight has the use of negative space for a mechanical purpose, and whatever the thoughts on the game, I think the wound system is just a brilliant microcosm of game design.
Well, I just want to say, from my part, Drake, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm very appreciative. I feel like we've been plugged into kind of like the mainstream of where solo game design is headed, straight from the mouth of one of the people who's heavily involved in this. So that's very, very exciting for me. And I'm also very excited that you expanded my the rules of good solo game design for me in my head as I think about these things. I'm really thankful to hear that game design is going in a more streamlined and easier to operate direction that really fits my lifestyle. And the last thing I'll say is curse you for making me put Merchant's Cove on my wish list. So, I mean, I'm sure you're not broken up about that. It sounds like a really, really cool game, and I'm very interested in it. All right, so thank you so much from my part.
If you don't like it, I'll refund it myself. So that's how confident I am.
I'm definitely down. I want to get a copy of that too, Drake. I echoing Martin, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a lot of good information here, good discussion. So that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Anytime that you guys would like to have somebody on, or if you need guests or more like guided discussion, like if you have a specific topic that you want to talk about, I'm always interested and up for things like this. I want to be part of the solo community and not just lurking outside of it, I guess.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to today's podcast. We appreciate you. And Drake, again, thank you for being here. And so again, for Solo Source, I am Michael Eckenfels.
I'm Martin Gonzalez.
And I'm special guest Drake Villareal.
And this was episode 71 of the Solosaurus podcast. Remember, we are part of the Dice Tower Network. And for even more Solosaurus than you could possibly handle, join our post-show discussions and other shenanigans on Facebook at facebook.com/Solosaurus. You can follow us on Instagram at Solosaurus Podcast, or shoot us an email at solosauruspodcast@gmail.com. We're also under podcasts on BGG. Martin, you want to talk a little bit about that? Last time, and I murder that.
We are on Board Game Geek under the gaming-related forum, podcasts, and blogs. Solosaurus. Really, just go to your favorite search engine and search for Solosaurus BGG, and you will find us on Board Game Geek. And by the way, Michael, you reminded me I should probably check our Instagram account.
Yeah, that occurs to me. That's something we need to engage more with. I don't know that we do. I'm frightened and confused, like Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer by Instagram.
Hey, that's a really relevant pop culture reference from Michael there. Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer.
30 years ago, yeah,
30 years ago.
Hey, there you go. I'll ask Michio to put a little Easter egg of him somewhere.
Yeah, perfect.
Oh my gosh, I love Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer. Also, speaking of Board Game Geek, if you are a member of that website, and if you're not, you should be, and you want to sport your very, very own shiny Solosaurus micro badge to show off your support and love for the show, just send me a geek mail at Dr. Henry Armitage. That's at Dr. Henry Armitage on Board Game Geek, and I will spot you the Geek Gold so that you can have your very own Solosaurus micro badge. I just handed out 3 micro badges this past week, so thank you for that support and for wanting to show off your Solosaurus love.
As always, thank you again to Stone Valley Games for being our sponsor. And for you folks in the audience, if there's anything particular game-wise or even designer-wise you'd like us to interview or games you'd like us to review, drop us a line again on Gmail or Facebook, anywhere you would like. And again, thank you for listening.